Hello there, everybody. This is Alex from Hardcore Guides, bringing you my guide for Dead Space 2 on Zealot difficulty. Today we are doing Chapter 1 entitled, Where Am I? And the chapter names for Dead Space 2, unfortunately, do not spell anything out, and on top of that, they also just seem to make hardly any cohesive sense, I guess. Well, it makes sense in terms of the chapter, but, they're just not really that fun to play around with. So, anyway, Zealot mode is going to be a lot harder than like Dead Space 1's impossible mode, in my opinion. I feel like Dead Space 2 is just a bit harder in general, mainly because of, ammo scarcity and supplies scarcity is just a bit stronger for Zealot mode, of course. Dead Space 2 also has much more enemies that tend to kind of just spawn and then waste a lot more ammo to take down, but there are methods in order to stop them from, completely wasting your ammo. Basically, there's a lot more emphasis on using, like, spikes and such, and just, specific pulls or whatever to kind of just shoot at enemies with telekinesis in order to do damage, and you can also upgrade your telekinesis to actually do more damage. However, this playthrough might be a bit weird and a bit different. I am going to say this right now. This guide might not be perfect for everybody, and it probably won't. It won't be. If this guide doesn't help you, then I apologize for that, of course. But there's tons of other, guides out there that I would assume do it way better than I do. But if it doesn't help, then hopefully it at least entertains. Because Dead Space 2 is a fun game to play through, and I have fun playing it. Even though I may have picked the potential wrong build, I'm still just going to go through it just as a normal game and just try to beat it with what I have rather than try to force myself to, start over and try to play at a different direction of playing. And what I mean by this is I am essentially going to be running plasma cutter and pulse rifle only. And this is a thing that I've always kind of kept for Dead Space 2 for my playthroughs. Because Dead Space 1, I'll always run plasma cutter and force gun on impossible mode. And for Dead Space 2, I've always felt like pulse rifle might be the better choice. And I've always kind of kept myself to that type of limit. And I'm kind of somewhat, not necessarily paying for it. Like, I'm still capable of beating the game. I haven't actually beaten it yet. Yeah, this is one of those guides where I'm just going to do when I had the videos for it. And rather than just wait until the guide is completely finished to know that I'm done. I'm going to be able to finish it. I know how to beat the game. I've done it plenty of times before. But this is going to be a much tougher playthrough than I would say some other playthroughs. So, I guess in a way you could consider this somewhat of a challenge run if you really wanted to take it that far. Now, let me just start off by saying that if you want to have a better run than I'm going to have, then using force gun might potentially save you a lot of trouble. And I say might because I'm not exactly 100% sure on whether or not force gun is completely good. However, I would take a wild guess and say most likely, because of the amount of enemies that you have to deal with on a daily basis in this game, it starts to really show that force gun could have potentially been a relatively powerful companion to have. So that's something I would look into if you're willing to do that. Now, the two-gun consensus is something I'm just going to run with anyway, just to kind of save on power nodes and save on like supplies and such. So that's kind of why I just run two guns all the time. So starting off, we're going to have our first group of enemies, and this is where the game's going to essentially teach you that using these impalement, techniques and what have you is going to come in very handy. Now, something Dead Space 2 starts to add as well is the idea that whenever an enemy is dead, that you need to melee the enemy in order to collect your item from the enemy. And this is actually a concept that I've actually grown really, really attached to in the Dead Space franchise. And whenever I go back to play Dead Space 1, I tend to kind of miss it. Coming into here, you're going to want to go straight to your left because that's where the first slasher is going to appear. These are basic, normal, regular, run-of-the-mill slashers. They're not too hard to fight. They don't do a lot of damage, and they usually die in one impalement. And that's a thing to keep in mind, is there's a lot of enemies that actually take more than one shot of an impalement to kill. Now, also, for those that might be new to Dead Space 2, just in general, what you can do whenever you kill an enemy is you can actually grab their arms and use, if it's a slasher, preferably. If it's a slasher, it has something of the sense of like a slashing type, arm, then you can actually peel off that arm by using telekinesis and then fire it back at another enemy. Now, again, this is one of those things of like, hey, I'm supposed to be the guide guy. I'm supposed to know this stuff, but I kind of, unfortunately, don't know that much. But I'm not 100% sure if whether or not an arm will do the same amount of damage as, say, a big, needle spike thing or whatever that we're shooting at these things. I'm not really 100% sure. Also, if you're looking for anything that happens to be spike worthy or impalement or have impalement potential, then look for the gleaming glow of something shiny that, pretty much just kind of differentiates itself from looking like your run-of-the-mill, just ammo and what have you. So, again, ammo scarcity is a big thing for Dead Space 2. However, it's not, like, going to completely kill you. I've had one time where I did run out of ammo, and that did suck. But for the most part, you don't really ever run out of ammo that much. It's just more so, like, if you've played Dead Space 1, you know how to use your ammo well, then typically you know how to kind of, handle that. And the idea with ammo is you want to just only go for, like, the main limbs, and then especially for this beginning part, you just want to kind of just shoot off the slasher's arm. He's not going to run toward you. None of the slashers are going to run toward you, at least in the beginning part, so don't worry about that too much. But yeah, pretty much I'm just going to do the same thing I kind of did in Dead Space 1, where I'm just going to essentially rely mostly on going for the legs. I took way too many shots to kill this guy. Going for melee on him is kind of hard because he's slashing and wailing around, and it's kind of hard to find any impalements to actually get him with it. But anyway, so typically there's a sort of plasma cutter limit type thing that you kind of want to aim for, and that is basically one shot to the leg, knock them on the ground, and then one shot to the arm. And if you really have to, if for some reason the enemy just still stays alive, if you've already cut off the leg and the arm and they just for some reason are still alive, then go for another arm. And that should be 3 shots. You should only really realistically want to go for those 3 shots of a plasma cutter because of, again, the ammo being a little bit more, more scarce than usual. Now, sometimes it also takes 2 shots to a leg to cut off a leg and then 1 shot to an arm, at least for the beginning slashers typically. But in these first sections, I would start to get, if I were you, I would start to kind of get used to the idea of just going for the arms and using those to kind of just shoot back at the enemies. I would say practice the best you can and impalement stuff, just to kind of save yourself the trouble for the future endeavor of having to potentially run out of ammo, if possible, and, being screwed and only being stuck with either melee or impalement objects. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, don't be afraid if you're like me and you're more of like a run and gun type guy, but, because that's just how I am. Like, don't be afraid of that. Like, you don't have to necessarily just devote yourself to only melee or whatever. Dead Space 2 doesn't need you to do that necessarily. You just need to make sure that your shots are a little bit more accurate than mine are. That's the biggest takeaway I can give you for advice, is just make sure that whatever you're shooting at, you're hopefully hitting. And depending on the enemy, whether or not you go for legs or arms is all really dependent on the enemy. There are some new enemy types that are added in this game, such as pukers and such, and there will be times where I just mainly go for the head. That's not necessarily the best idea. For me, my Dead Space playthroughs have always been reliant on going for legs and then arms right after, and never really heads, because I feel like heads just don't really give you much from doing that. However, if you do shoot off an enemy's head, they typically have a hard time to kind of like see you, and I think they probably tend to struggle more to kind of, chase you down, because they don't really know where you're at. They can't really see. So that could potentially prove to be an advantage in some scenarios, but I feel like going for a leg and then going for an arm works better. But yeah, for this part right here, just stand back to this door. You can go upstairs, because that's where they spawn, if you want to make it faster. Also, try not to miss any shots the best you can. We are still early game, so it's not like it's a big deal, but I would suggest still not missing any shots as best as you possibly can. You don't have to play it perfectly. You just gotta play it enough to where your shots are at least, you know, really, really well. I don't know what to say. Good. I don't know. You don't need to be a surgeon for this to work out, but you know, it kind of comes with the territory for Dead Space, though. And the thing is, to keep in mind, Dead Space 2 is a bit harder than Dead Space 1, and I will stand firmly by that. But I'll also say this, too. I think Dead Space 2 is a much better game than Dead Space 1. I think both Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 are fantastic games, and I feel like Dead Space 2 is the epitome of Dead Space. I think they did this really well. So, next, you're going to have a slasher that's going to run through the stasis. Now, I would recommend using stasis on him, just because... even though he runs to the stasis and he does get, you know, frozen in time, that doesn't necessarily help much, considering the fact that he's just going to pop right back out anyway. So it's better you just go ahead and just re-stasis him and then just use the stasis module after you stasis the door. God, I say that a lot. After you stasis the door, use the module so that way you have a full charge. So now we're going to be introduced to the new enemy. This is the Puker type. Going for the head mainly makes it to where he can't shoot, like he can't spitball you, as far as I'm aware. There are 2 enemies in this room, so do be careful. There's one on the left. Just stay back where I'm at into this little like hallway here, so that way you can kind of just avoid any drop shots from these guys. But yeah, look how I'm basically missing tons of shots from just doing that. So Pukers can still technically shoot out of their neck hole. That is a thing they can still do, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think they... When they don't have their head, I don't think they have the ability to spitball it. That's the key object. Now, Pukers are weird because they can either do a ton of damage or not a lot of damage. And the way that they work is that they spitball you, which is mostly later game. That's mostly like mid to late game type stuff that happens. When they start to do that, you get slowed down, but you don't take much damage. You take barely any damage from spitballs anyway. However, from a puke, then you will be taking a lot of damage, and it will burn you for a few seconds, and that's not fun to have. Staying away from pukers is obviously a clear common sense option to have. Sometimes it's kind of hard to do that, but, you know, it is what it is. Now, whenever you do go fight a puker, I would recommend at least just shooting out the legs, make them crawl, and then shoot out their arms right after. Just to get the extra damage and, you know, get the Dead Space kill. Also, this guy's alive, so just, you know, watch out for that. I always tend to forget that he's there. It just happens. If worse comes to worse, I would also recommend using stasis. And the thing is with this game, stasis seems to be a very regular option that comes up. And, hold on, how do I explain this? What I'm trying to say is that stasis modules seem to appear a lot, so it kind of makes it a little bit easier to kind of just use stasis a bit more than usual. And I would also recommend upgrading your stasis rather than your rig. That's something to kind of keep in mind. Also, real quick, just to explain this real fast, I'm going to be buying mostly just the buyable suits, because there's a lot of suits that I have that are, you know, zero cost suits, but as far as I know, I think they're like DLC stuff. I'm also playing on PC, so I'm not sure if they came with it. I don't remember. So I'm going to try to make it as casual friendly as I possibly can to those that, you know, might not have those suits. If you have those suits, by all means, go for it. If you have the zero cost weapons, by all means, go for them. You know, you don't have to play exactly how I play. I'm trying to play the best I can to the ability of like what Dead Space 2 originally was. And if you don't want to play that way, that's perfectly fine and content. So I would recommend it. Any way to make your game easier on you is recommended. But yeah. So stasis, you know, go use stasis on enemies that get too close. Use stasis on enemies that, you know, prove to be way too much of a pain in the ass to deal with, and yada yada yada. So this ass wipe, I don't remember what this is called. It's like a bipedal type. I don't know if this is it's not the tripod, right? I think that's it's got 3 limbs, so maybe it is. So this fight is mostly just a run around the arena type fight. Just run with not necessarily with your back turned. If you are running with your back turned to the enemy, then they typically can't hit you as long as you're running in a relatively straight line with no obstacles kind of getting in your way. If you turn around and you're running, you know, without shooting, then you have the ability to still have enough distance between you and the enemy to kind of keep yourself from getting, you know, leaped on and getting damaged. And that's the thing you kind of want to avoid, is getting that damage. But the biggest thing here, the biggest takeaway, is you want to use stasis and you want to try to hit him in the body. Don't go for the legs. That's something that I do for enemies later on in the game. That's just a thing I've always done with Dead Space. So pretty much just, you know, have much better accurate shots than I do. That's kind of the key aspect here. And I apologize for not being the best Dead Space 2 player, but it is what it is, and I've already kind of made my bed. I might as well sleep in it, right? So it's too late for that. He does kind of stay alive after he already killed off his 2 legs. He already shut them off. He does stay alive, and I think he might still do damage once he flails around for a second or two. So just kind of stay away, let him finish himself off, and then grab the schematic or whatever. Or not schematic, but the semiconductor, and just, you know, take off from there. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of Chapter 1. Pretty fun chapter. Good start to a chapter, except for the whole having no weapons segment. But, you know, it's just how it is. Ah, fuck. Alright, so anyway, yeah. See you guys next time. And take care, everybody.